before this life.
The case you're about to explore involves a child who claimed memories of a life they never lived. We'll examine the documented evidence, explore what was verified, and consider multiple explanations. This is a mystery of memory and consciousness that remains unexplained. London, England, spring of 1972. Margaret Mitchell watched her 5-year-old daughter Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by paper and colored pencils. But Sarah wasn't drawing flowers or houses like other children her age. She was creating something that would eventually bring Egyptologists to their suburban home, seeking answers to questions that challenged everything they understood about memory and time. Sarah was drawing hieroglyphics, perfect, intricate hieroglyphics that she had never been taught. It had started 3 months earlier, in February. Sarah woke screaming from a nightmare, crying about golden masks and darkness. When Margaret rushed to comfort her, Sarah said something that made no sense. "They're putting me in the box, the gold box. I don't want to go in the dark." Margaret assumed it was just a bad dream. Children have nightmares. But Sarah's dreams continued, night after night. And they became more specific. She described elaborate ceremonies, men with shaved heads wearing white linen, the smell of incense and myrrh, massive stone columns covered in painted symbols, a palace with gardens, and a sacred lake. "When I was king," Sarah said one morning at breakfast, as casually as if she were discussing a television program, "when I lived in the big house by the river." Margaret's husband John laughed it off. Children have vivid imaginations. Perhaps Sarah had seen something about Egypt on television or in a picture book at school. But Sarah had never shown any particular interest in Egypt, and the details she described seemed far too sophisticated for a 5-year-old's fantasy. Then came the drawings. Sarah began filling page after page with symbols, not random scribbles, but organized, deliberate characters arranged in careful cartouches, the oval frames that ancient Egyptians used to enclose royal names. Margaret showed the drawings to Sarah's teacher, who was equally baffled. These weren't the simple Egyptian symbols you might see in a children's book. These were complex hieroglyphic combinations. One drawing in particular caught Margaret's attention. It showed 2 cartouches side by side. Inside one, Sarah had drawn a scarab beetle, a sun disk, and 3 vertical lines. Inside the other, a different combination of symbols. Margaret had no idea what they meant. But something about the precision of Sarah's hand, the confidence with which she drew these ancient symbols, unsettled her deeply. As winter turned to spring, Sarah's claims became more detailed and more disturbing. She talked about being a king when she was young, about priests who made decisions for her, about a wife whose name she couldn't quite remember, Ankh something, she said, about hunting in the desert and riding in golden chariots. She described a specific room in a palace, a columned hall with paintings of birds and plants on every surface. She talked about gardens with pools where lotus flowers floated. She mentioned a city she called Waset, though her parents had never heard of such a place. Most troubling were her descriptions of dying. "I was sick," she told her mother one evening. "My leg hurt so much. The priests tried to make me better, but I kept getting worse. I was scared. I didn't want to die so young." She was only 5 years old. What 5-year-old talks about dying young? John Mitchell remained skeptical, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was happening. In May of 1972, she wrote a letter to the British Museum's Department of Egyptian Antiquities, describing her daughter's claims and enclosing several of Sarah's drawings. She expected to be dismissed as a delusional parent. Instead, 3 weeks later, she received a phone call from Dr. Edmund Graves, a curator of Egyptian artifacts. He wanted to meet Sarah, and he had questions about the hieroglyphics she had drawn, hieroglyphics that, he said, appeared to be authentic representations of a very specific pharaoh's royal names. The investigation into Sarah Mitchell's impossible memories was about to begin. Dr. Edmund Graves arrived at the Mitchell home on a rainy Tuesday in June 1972, carrying a leather portfolio filled with photographs and documents. He was a cautious man, trained in academic rigor, and he made it clear from the start that he approached Sarah's case with healthy skepticism. But he was also curious, because Sarah's drawings had caught his attention in a way that dozens of letters from supposed psychics and reincarnation enthusiasts never had. The hieroglyphics Sarah had drawn represented two names: Tutankhamun's birth name, Tutankhaten, and his throne name, Neb-Kheperur. She had drawn them with remarkable accuracy. Not perfectly, but far better than a child copying from a book would manage. More intriguingly, she had included small details that most reference books of that era didn't show: the specific number of sun rays in the Aten disk, the precise orientation of the scarab beetle. These were nuances that required either direct study of authentic Egyptian artifacts or access to specialized academic texts. Dr. Graves sat down with Sarah at the kitchen table. He brought no books, no pictures, nothing that might prompt her or give her clues. He simply asked, "Sarah, can you tell me about when you lived in Egypt?" What followed was documented in Dr. Graves's field notes, which would later be shared with Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. Sarah described a palace that she called her Big House. She said it had many rooms with tall columns painted red and gold. There were gardens with rectangular pools. She talked about a sacred lake where priests performed ceremonies. She described the throne room with remarkable specificity: massive pillars decorated with lotus and papyrus designs, walls covered in painted reliefs showing the king receiving gifts from foreign lands, a dais where the throne sat elevated above the rest of the room. When Dr. Graves asked about daily life, Sarah talked about wearing heavy crowns that hurt her neck, about ceremonies where she had to stand for hours while priests chanted, about eating dates and figs and drinking beer, which made her parents exchange uncomfortable glances. She mentioned hunting birds in the marshes with a throwing stick, riding in a chariot that bounced terribly on rough ground, watching craftsmen make furniture inlaid with gold and precious stones. And she talked about her name. "I was called Tutankhaten when I was small," she said, "but they changed it. The priests changed it to Tutankhamun because we stopped worshiping the Aten. My father had worshipped the Aten, but the priests said it was wrong." Dr. Graves sat very still. This was historically accurate information about the religious transition from Atenism back to the traditional Egyptian pantheon, information not commonly taught to children in 1972. Over the following weeks, Dr. Graves conducted multiple interviews with Sarah, carefully documenting every claim she made. He brought in Dr. Patricia Harding, another Egyptologist, to ensure objectivity and prevent leading questions. Together, they compiled a list of specific details Sarah had provided. She claimed to have lived in a palace at Thebes, which she called Waset, the ancient Egyptian name for the city. She described the layout of the palace complex, including administrative buildings, royal quarters, and ceremonial halls. She talked about a wife named Ankh-something. The researchers noted this might refer to Ankh-Hesenamen, Tutankhamun's queen. She described religious ceremonies involving the god Amun, and mentioned moving away from worshipping the sun disk, the Aten, a reference to the Counter-Reformation after Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution. She claimed to have died young, around age 18 or 19, from an illness that began with a leg injury that wouldn't heal. She described her tomb preparation, talking about canopic jars for organs, multiple coffins nested inside each other, and a gold mask placed over her face. Most remarkably, she drew specific scenes: a king hunting from a chariot, a king receiving tribute, a king making offerings to the gods. When the researchers compared her drawings to scenes found in Tutankhamun's tomb, the compositional similarities were striking. Dr. Graves and Dr. Harding began the painstaking process of verification. They consulted Howard Carter's excavation reports from the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. They reviewed archaeological surveys of ancient Thebes. They examined scholarly publications about the 18th dynasty. The Malkata Palace complex at Thebes, built primarily by Amenhotep III, matched several of Sarah's descriptions. The columned halls, the sacred lake, the garden pools, all confirmed by archaeological evidence. The religious transition Sarah described was historically accurate. Tutankhamun had indeed been born Tutankhaten during his father Akhenaten's worship of the Aten, and his name was changed to Tutankhamun when the traditional gods were restored. The detail about dying young from a leg injury was particularly interesting. While the exact cause of Tutankhamun's death remained debated, Carter's examination of the mummy had noted what appeared to be a leg fracture. And some scholars theorize this injury might have led to infection and death. But could Sarah have learned these details from books or television? The researchers examined every children's book about ancient Egypt available in British libraries in 1972. They reviewed BBC programming. They interviewed Sarah's teachers and her parents about what educational material she had access to. The conclusion was troubling. While basic information about Tutankhamun was certainly available, many of Sarah's specific details were not found in popular sources. The layout of Malkata Palace, the religious naming transition, the specific hieroglyphic variation she had drawn, these required access to academic texts and archaeological reports that a 5-year-old couldn't possibly obtain or comprehend. In July 1972, Dr. Graves decided to conduct a more rigorous test. He brought a collection of photographs to the Mitchell home, 40 images of various Egyptian artifacts, tomb paintings, and archaeological sites, mixed randomly. Only 5 of the images related to Tutankhamun. He spread them on the table and asked Sarah to look at them. She immediately picked out a photograph of a gilded shrine from Tutankhamun's tomb, pointing to a hunting scene. "That's me," she said, "hunting in the marshes." She identified a photograph of the Golden Throne, recognizing the sun disk imagery and saying, "That was before they changed my name." She pointed to an image of canopic jars and said, "Those hold the pieces they take out when you die." But most remarkable was her reaction to a photograph of the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb taken during Carter's excavation. The image showed stacked furniture, boxes, and ceremonial objects in chaotic arrangement. Sarah became visibly upset. Why is everything broken? Why did they mess it all up? It wasn't supposed to look like that. Dr. Graves later noted in his report, "The child appeared genuinely distressed by the disarray, as if witnessing vandalism of something precious to her." The investigation was deepening, and the questions were multiplying. In August 1972, Dr. Graves arranged for Sarah and her parents to visit the British Museum's Egyptian galleries. This would be the most comprehensive test yet, placing Sarah in front of actual artifacts without any preparation or prompting. The visit was carefully documented. Dr. Harding accompanied the family, taking detailed notes. They brought a small tape recorder to capture Sarah's spontaneous reactions. The results were extraordinary. Sarah walked through the galleries with a confidence that seemed unusual for a 5-year-old. She ignored many displays entirely, but stopped abruptly in front of specific artifacts. When she reached a case containing Shabta's small funerary figurines, she said, "Those are the servants for the afterlife. You're supposed to have lots of them so they can do your work for you when you're dead." This was accurate. Shabtis were indeed believed to serve the deceased in the afterlife, performing agricultural labor on their behalf. She recognized canopic jars immediately, pointing to each one and naming what it would contain: liver, lungs, stomach, intestines. Then she paused and asked, "Where's the heart jar?" Dr. Harding gently explained that ancient Egyptians left the heart in the body because they believed it was needed for judgment in the afterlife. Sarah nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Yes, they weigh your heart against the feather. This is the fundamental concept of Ma'at, the judgment of the dead, not typically taught to kindergartners." The most dramatic moment came when Sarah saw a limestone relief fragment depicting a royal figure making offerings to the god Amun. She stopped dead in her tracks. "That's wrong," she said, pointing at the relief. "The crown's not right. That's not the right crown for that ceremony." Dr. Harding was stunned. She asked Sarah what crown should be shown. Sarah described the blue crown, the kepresh, used in military and ceremonial contexts. She said the white crown or the double crown would be more appropriate for offerings to Amun. Dr. Harding later verified that Sarah's liturgical knowledge was correct. Different crowns had different ceremonial uses. For a child to spontaneously critique the iconographic accuracy of an ancient Egyptian relief was unprecedented. But the moment that convinced Dr. Graves something genuinely anomalous was occurring came when they reached a small, rarely noticed display case. It contained fragments of furniture inlay from various tombs, small pieces of ivory, faience, and gilded wood. These were not famous artifacts. Most museum visitors walked past without a glance. Sarah pressed her face against the glass, staring at a particular fragment, a small piece of furniture decoration showing a bound captive. "I had a chair with these," she said quietly. "Captives on the legs. 9 of them, 1 for each enemy." After the museum visit, Dr. Graves went back to his office and pulled Howard Carter's excavation catalog. Throne number 91, from Tutankhamun's tomb. A ceremonial chair with 9 bound captives depicted on the legs and footrest, representing the 9 traditional enemies of Egypt. This detail had never been widely publicized. It appeared in Carter's technical reports and specialized academic publications, but not in popular books about Tutankhamun. There was no reasonable way Sarah could have known about this specific piece of furniture and its symbolic decoration. Dr. Graves contacted Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, a psychiatrist who had spent decades documenting cases of children claiming past life memories. Stevenson had developed rigorous protocols for investigating such cases, and he agreed to review Sarah's case. In September 1972, Stevenson traveled to London to conduct his own interviews. Dr. Stevenson's methodology was meticulous. He interviewed Sarah multiple times, varying his approach to ensure her story remained consistent. He conducted extensive interviews with her parents, teachers, and anyone who had regular contact with her. He examined the family's home for any books, magazines, or materials about Egypt. He found nothing beyond a children's encyclopedia with a brief 2-page section on ancient Egypt that mentioned pyramids and mummies, but contained no information about Tutankhamun specifically. He verified that Sarah had not visited any Egyptian exhibitions before her claims began. The last major Tutankhamun exhibition in London had been in 1972 at the British Museum, but Sarah's memories had started in February, before this exhibition opened. Stevenson documented additional details Sarah provided. She described the process of mummification with disturbing accuracy, the removal of organs through the nose and abdomen, the drying with natron salt, the wrapping with linen bandages and amulets placed between layers. She talked about the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual performed on mummies to restore their senses in the afterlife. She mentioned specific gods by name: Amun, Ra, Osiris, Anubis, Thoth. She could describe their appearances and their roles in the divine hierarchy. Most intriguingly, she spoke a few phrases that Dr. Graves identified as phonetically similar to Middle Egyptian pronunciation, though whether this was genuine xenoglossy or coincidental sounds remained debatable. Stevenson also documented physical evidence, though this aspect of the case remained more speculative. Sarah had a small birthmark on her left leg, just above the knee. While hardly conclusive, this aligned with the location of the fracture found on Tutankhamun's mummy. She exhibited an unusual phobia. She became distressed in small, dark, enclosed spaces. Given her descriptions of being sealed in nested coffins, this could be interpreted as a trauma memory or simply a common childhood fear. More interesting was her reaction to certain smells. When Stevenson brought various incense resins to test her responses, Sarah immediately identified frankincense and myrrh, saying they smelled like the temple. She had no prior exposure to these scents. Throughout his investigation, Stevenson carefully considered conventional explanations. Cryptomnesia, hidden memory of information unconsciously absorbed, was possible. Perhaps Sarah had seen a documentary or overheard adult conversations about Egypt without anyone remembering. But the specificity of her knowledge argued against simple cryptomnesia. The furniture detail, the crown ceremonial protocols, the palace layout descriptions. These weren't the kinds of information that would stick in a child's memory from casual exposure. Information leakage from her parents was also considered. But John and Margaret Mitchell had no particular interest in Egyptology. They owned no books on the subject. Neither had visited Egypt or studied ancient history beyond basic schooling. The researchers interviewed neighbors, relatives, and family friends. No one could identify any source for Sarah's knowledge. Genetic memory, the controversial idea that memories might be inherited, was discussed but dismissed as lacking scientific foundation. Elaborate fantasy and coincidence remained possible. Perhaps Sarah was an imaginative child who happened to guess correctly about many details. But the accumulation of accurate specifics strained this explanation to the breaking point. By October 1972, Stevenson had documented over 60 specific claims Sarah had made about ancient Egyptian royal life. Approximately 40 of these could be verified against historical and archaeological records. Of the verified claims, 38 were accurate. The 2 inaccuracies were minor. She described the throne room as having 12 columns, when archaeological evidence suggested 10, and she misidentified one hieroglyphic symbol in her drawings. A success rate of 95% for verifiable historical claims made by a 5-year-old, with no apparent access to the information she possessed. The investigation had moved beyond curious anomaly into genuinely unexplained territory. By November 1972, Dr. Ian Stevenson had completed his preliminary investigation. He classified Sarah Mitchell's case as a strong example of what he called past life memory claims with significant evidential value. But Stevenson, ever the cautious scientist, refused to claim this proved reincarnation. Instead, he outlined what the evidence could and couldn't tell us. What the evidence demonstrated: a 5-year-old child possessed detailed, accurate knowledge about ancient Egyptian royal life, palace architecture, religious ceremonies, and specific artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb, knowledge she could not have obtained through normal means given her age, education, and environment. What the evidence could not demonstrate: the source of this knowledge, or whether it genuinely represented memories of being Tutankhamun. The case raised profound questions about memory, consciousness, and the boundaries of conventional explanation. Those who interpret Sarah's case as evidence of reincarnation point to several compelling factors. First, the spontaneity of her memories. She wasn't prompted or coached. Her claims began unprompted at age 5, which fits the typical pattern Stevenson observed children usually report past life memories between ages 2 and 7, with memories fading by age 10. Second, the emotional authenticity. Sarah's distress at seeing the tomb contents in disarray, her fear of enclosed spaces, her detailed descriptions delivered with genuine conviction, these suggested experiential memory rather than learned information. Third, the specificity and accuracy. She didn't make vague claims about being Egyptian royalty. She provided precise, verifiable details about palace layouts, ceremonial protocols, and specific artifacts. Fourth, the absence of plausible normal sources. Despite exhaustive investigation, researchers couldn't identify how Sarah accessed this information. From the reincarnation perspective, Sarah's case represents a soul memory consciousness carrying experiences across time, manifesting in a modern British child as fragmentary but authentic recollections of a life lived 3,300 years ago. Supporters note that ancient Egyptian religious beliefs centered on the soul's journey through death and rebirth. If reincarnation occurs, perhaps Tutankhamun's consciousness, having undergone the elaborate preservation rituals of mummification, retained its identity more strongly than most. Skeptics offered several alternative theories. The most common was sophisticated cryptomnesia. Perhaps Sarah had been exposed to information about Tutankhamun through sources no one could later recall, a library book her mother browsed while Sarah sat nearby, a television documentary that aired while the family visited relatives, overheard adult conversations at a museum or historical site. The human mind, especially a child's, absorbs vast amounts of environmental information unconsciously. Sarah might have constructed her narrative from these forgotten fragments, her imagination filling gaps and creating what felt like coherent memories. The 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had generated enormous publicity. By 1972, this had died down but wasn't entirely absent from popular culture. Perhaps Sarah encountered more about Tutankhamun than her parents realized. The verification bias must also be considered. When researchers investigate past life claims, they naturally focus on accurate details and may underweight inaccuracies or vague statements. Sarah made many claims. Were researchers selectively emphasizing the hits while ignoring the misses? Dr. Graves himself acknowledged this possibility in his notes. He tried to counter it by documenting everything Sarah said, not just successful verifications. But the human tendency toward confirmation bias is powerful and subtle. A crucial question. How accessible was detailed information about Tutankhamun in 1972 London? More accessible than in 1922, certainly. Howard Carter's excavation reports had been published. Several academic books about Tutankhamun existed. The British Museum had Egyptian artifacts on display. But here's what researchers found when they conducted a systematic review. Most children's books about ancient Egypt in 1972 mentioned pyramids, mummies, and sometimes pharaohs, but rarely Tutankhamun specifically. He wasn't yet the cultural icon he would become after the 1972 British Museum exhibition and the later traveling exhibitions of the 1970s. Details about the Malkata Palace layout appeared only in specialized archaeological journals and academic monographs, not exactly browsing material for a 5-year-old. The furniture detail, the ceremonial chair with 9 bound captives, appeared in Howard Carter's excavation catalog, but had never been featured in popular publications. Information about crown ceremonial protocols existed only in academic Egyptology texts analyzing royal iconography. Could Sarah have somehow accessed these obscure sources? It seemed nearly impossible. But nearly impossible isn't absolutely impossible. What frustrated researchers most was the pattern of Sarah's knowledge. If she had learned about Tutankhamun from a book or television program, you would expect her to know the famous elements: the golden death mask, the curse of the pharaohs, the treasures discovered by Carter. Instead, she knew obscure details about daily palace life, ceremonial protocols, and specific furniture pieces, while often being vague about the dramatic discovery narrative that popular sources emphasized. She could describe what it felt like to wear the heavy crowns, but didn't mention the famous golden mask until researchers specifically asked about it. She knew about Shabti servants and canopic jars, but didn't talk about the supposed curse that had killed Carter's excavation team members, a story widely circulated in popular culture. Her knowledge seemed to come from the inside, from living experience, rather than from the outside narrative of archaeological discovery. This pattern didn't prove reincarnation, but it made normal information acquisition difficult to explain. Stevenson conducted follow-up interviews with Sarah at ages 7, 9, and 12. This long-term observation revealed the typical pattern he had documented in hundreds of other cases. The memories faded. By age 7, Sarah still remembered making the claims and visiting the museum, but the vivid, experiential quality had diminished. She described it as remembering a dream knowing it happened, but unable to recapture the intensity. By age 9, she rarely spoke about Egypt spontaneously. When asked, she could recall some details, but said they felt distant, like something she'd read about rather than lived. By age 12, she maintained interest in ancient Egypt, but approached it academically, like any student studying history. The personal, emotional connection had largely disappeared. This fading pattern is consistent across past life memory cases. Most children stop discussing their alleged previous lives by age 8 to 10, with memories becoming progressively less vivid and emotionally immediate. Whether this represents genuine past life memories fading as the new personality develops, or simply a child outgrowing an elaborate fantasy, remains debatable. Sarah's case left researchers with profound questions. If this was reincarnation, why Tutankhamun? Why would a pharaoh's soul reincarnate as a working-class British girl? What determines where and when consciousness returns? If this was cryptomnesia, what was the source? Despite exhaustive searching, no one identified where Sarah encountered the obscure details she possessed. If this was elaborate fantasy, how did a 5-year-old maintain such consistent, historically accurate detail across months of investigation? And perhaps most troubling, what does it mean that we cannot definitively answer these questions? Sarah Mitchell's case remains in Dr. Ian Stevenson's files at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, classified as unsolved, a case with strong evidence that resists easy explanation. The mystery endures. Sarah Mitchell's memories of being Tutankhamun offer us something rare, a window into one of humanity's oldest questions. Can consciousness survive death? Can identity persist across time? Or are we witnessing something else entirely, the strange ways memory and imagination can intertwine in the developing mind of a child? This case contributes to a body of evidence that refuses to be easily dismissed or easily confirmed. Dr. Ian Stevenson documented over 2,500 similar cases during his career, each one raising the same fundamental questions about the nature of memory and identity. What makes Sarah's case particularly significant is the historical distance involved. Most past life memory cases involve lives that ended within the past century, lives for which living witnesses or detailed records still exist, making verification easier but also raising questions about information leakage. But Tutankhamun died 3,300 years ago. There are no living witnesses. There are no photographs or recordings. The only information available comes from archaeological evidence and ancient texts. Sources a 5-year-old British girl in 1972 should not have been able to access or comprehend. Sarah's case fits patterns Stevenson observed across hundreds of investigations. Children who claim past life memories typically begin speaking about them between ages 2 and 7. The memories are often vivid, emotionally charged, and accompanied by behaviors or phobias that match the claimed previous life. In cases involving violent or traumatic deaths, children often have birthmarks or birth defects corresponding to fatal wounds, though this physical evidence remains controversial and difficult to verify conclusively. The memories fade as children grow older, usually disappearing by age 10. Whether this represents integration of the new personality or simply the natural way children's fantasies evolve remains unknown. Strong cases like Sarah's share certain characteristics. They involve specific, verifiable details rather than vague claims. They occur in children with no apparent access to the information they possess. They demonstrate emotional authenticity and behavioral consistency over time. But even strong cases don't constitute proof. They constitute mystery. What does it mean when a child possesses knowledge from ancient times? If Sarah truly remembered being Tutankhamun, her case suggests consciousness can transcend not just death, but vast spans of time. Identity becomes something deeper than biology, more enduring than the physical brain. This aligns with ancient Egyptian beliefs about the soul, the Ka, the Ba, the Aaka, different aspects of consciousness that could persist beyond bodily death. Perhaps the elaborate preservation of royal mummies, the detailed tomb texts, the complex funerary rituals were not superstition, but sophisticated attempts to anchor consciousness across the boundary between life and death. But we must also consider that humans have always sought immortality, always wanted to believe that we are more than temporary arrangements of matter. The reincarnation interpretation may tell us more about our hopes than about the nature of consciousness. Perhaps the most important lesson from Sarah's case is this: we don't have to choose between absolute belief and absolute skepticism. We can acknowledge that something extraordinary happened. A 5-year-old possessed detailed, accurate knowledge she shouldn't have had while remaining honest about our inability to explain it definitively. Science progresses not by having all the answers, but by asking better questions. Sarah's case asks us, what is memory? Can information be transmitted across time in ways we don't yet understand? What is the relationship between consciousness and the physical brain? These questions matter whether the explanation turns out to be reincarnation, some unknown property of memory and genetics, quantum information transfer, or something entirely unanticipated by current science. Tutankhamun died young, probably around age 19. His reign lasted less than a decade. He was a relatively minor pharaoh, overshadowed by greater rulers before and after. But the discovery of his tomb in 1922 transformed him into the most famous pharaoh in history. His golden mask became an icon of ancient Egypt. His name became synonymous with archaeological wonder. If Sarah Mitchell truly carried memories of being this boy king, then Tutankhamun's consciousness witnessed an ironic immortality being forgotten for 3,000 years, then remembered more vividly than any other Egyptian ruler. Whether through reincarnation, collective human memory, or some mechanism we cannot yet comprehend, the boy who died at 19 lives on in ways the ancient Egyptian priests could never have imagined. His tomb was meant to house his soul for eternity. Perhaps, in some sense, it worked. If this case made you question what children can know about history, if it opened your mind to mysteries that transcend time, you're exploring the boundaries of memory itself. Every week, we investigate another child who remembered being someone from history, another claim that challenges what we know about consciousness and the past. Subscribe to Before This Life. Join thousands exploring when children remember history's icons, because some memories transcend time. Some children carry knowledge they shouldn't possess, and some identities echo across millennia. What's your take on Sarah's case? Could a 5-year-old British girl truly remember being an Egyptian pharaoh who died 3,300 years ago? Or is there another explanation for her impossible knowledge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's explore this mystery together. Sarah Mitchell is now in her 50s. She became a teacher, married, had children of her own. She rarely discusses her childhood claims anymore. But sometimes, she says, when she sees images of ancient Egypt, she feels something not quite memory, not quite recognition, just a sense of strange familiarity, like hearing a song from a life she might have lived, or might have dreamed, or might have been. This has been Before This Life.